Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl. I am the center's coordinator, and I will also be today's moderator. More importantly, to my left, and your right probably, sits today's speaker, Jakub Muchowski, who is also currently a visiting scholar at the Center for Philosophical Studies of History in Oulu with us. And he will be speaking today about the topic on reading historical writing and presentism. Jakub is an adjunct professor at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, I hope it's somewhat right, in Poland. His main research interests lie in theory and methodology of history, the theory of historical writing, history of historiography, and Holocaust and genocide studies. Of Jakub's many publications, I only want to name a few recent ones in English. He also has a lot more in Polish, so if you can read that language, I recommend you also look at those publications. But in English, he most recently published The Ethics of Narrative, a reader's dialogue, with the co-authors with many other renowned people in our field. And it's a sort of discussion piece of a new book or collected volume of essays by Hayden White, which is called The Ethics of Narrative, and it came out with Rethinking History just this summer. Then last year, he published Figural Realism and the Politics of Literature. Hayden White and Jacques Rancière read Erich Auerbach in the Journal of Philosophy of History. And in 2022, he published the Anthropocene Contract. What kind of historian-reader agreement does environmental historiography need? Which was published in the anthology Perspective on Public Policy in Societal Environmental Crisis, What the Future Needs from History. And this is open access, the book, and I just yesterday downloaded the PDF, but I haven't got around to read it, so I suggest you download it too and read it. This is the first event of our autumn seminar. I'm happy and proud to announce that after today, we will have 4 more sessions in our autumn seminar, of which the first will already happen today in 3 weeks. So the September 26th, and we will have then Louis-Étienne Villeneuve speak about colligatory concepts and colligations in integrated history and philosophy of science. Thereafter, on October 31st, we'll have Matt Waltzlegel talking about rival interpretative approaches in the historiography of science. So we got 2 events on the historiography of science and philosophy. Then on November 28, we'll have Veronica Tozzi speaking on trust testimony and the epistemic value of historical narrative. And finally, on December 19, we'll have Yassin Ramazan give a talk about history of nature in medieval Islamic thought. And as per usual, more information about these events will be published in a timely fashion on our social media channels and our homepage. Now, if you want to stay updated about our activities, I suggest you follow our social media channels. We have Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and we are about to set up a Blue Sky account now too, as there seems to be a big exodus from Twitter, or now X, thanks to Elon Musk and his behavior. If you're interested in becoming a visiting scholar, as Jakub currently is, please look at our homepage. All information is there. And if you'd like to speak in our seminar in this setting, or a setting very much like this, fully online, we do that too, please also contact us. Now, a few technicalities before we begin. Let me just say first, I will forcibly mute online, and I will immediately do that now, for the duration of Jakub's talk, because we have a big speaker in the middle of the room, just in case to avoid any disturbance. But worry not, in the discussion session, you will be liberated again and can online and can take part normally. After Jakub's talk, he will roughly talk 45 minutes. There will be a discussion session that I will moderate. In the discussion part, we will alternate between the room and online. So especially for the online folk, if you have a question or a comment, please first indicate so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's then your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or you can write a question in the chat and I will read it out loud. Yes, that was it from me. I will just share your presentation before we. Thank you very much, Jakub, for accepting our invitation. Give me a second and get started. Okay.
Thank you very much, Georg, for this generous introduction. Here. Hi everyone, thank you for showing up. First, I want to thank the Center for having me here and Georg for organizing this seminar. It's an honor and pleasure to talk here. How do I? Okay. Yes. Okay, so I will just get into it. So I've been interested in democratic historical writing for a few years. Some of you already know that. And by democratic, I mean, first and foremost, egalitarian writing, that is, writing that seeks to avoid reproducing hierarchical relations between authors, text readers, and past actors, as well as between academic disciplines and society. And in this respect, I'm interested in questions and concepts such as the reader contract in historical writing, acknowledgement, the social role of history. So one of the questions I address concerns historians' communication with the public, the main object of which is the transfer of historical knowledge. And the question is how to frame the relationship between the articulation of knowledge and the reading response. The question of reader response to historical writing points to a number of tensions between the expectations of historians and their readers. One practice that both unites and divides both groups is presentism. The rules for the production of reliable historical knowledge impose an obligation on authors of historical writing to avoid bias and the subordination of the research past to contemporary issues and interests. Audiences of historical writing, on the other hand, do not confine themselves to being interested in historical knowledge, but turn to it, for example, for the pleasure of immersing themselves in another world, the excitement of identifying with actors and following their stories, or seeking suggestions for understanding the realities in which they live. Presentism creates tensions in the relationship between historians and their audiences. Hence, it seems important to me to address it from the perspective of democratic historical writing. Presentism has, of course, been discussed many times in the debates of historical theory. More moderate voices have pointed out that practices of presentism are unavoidable in the work of historians. We conduct our research from the position that was not available to the past actors. We can observe the continuities and consequences of the actions and processes in which they participated. In addition, we apply to the evidence, we study theories, methods, concepts that did not exist in the past. In up-to-date and detailed reporting on the history of the theoretical debate, Georg Gangl calls these two presentisms, interpretative and evidentiary anachronisms. He specifies another category of presentism, that is pragmatic anachronism, which includes historians' actions to communicate with their audiences. As an example, he points to the use of contemporary literary languages in historical writing instead of those used by the past actors. It can be added here that modern audiences are at least partially familiar with the research theories, methods, and concepts, and they are using research and historical writing also enables them to better understand the representations of the past offered to them. The pragmatic practices of presentism are little dealt with by Gangl, as they generally do not fulfill the cognitive tasks that remain the focus of his attention. Because of my interest, this group of presentism is the most important here. So the objectives of my talk. So in this talk, I take on the task of at least partially answering the question of the role of presentism in equal communication between historians and their audiences. Thus, I asked to what extent the construction of a presentist or anti-presentist reading by authors of historical writing is egalitarian, and to what extent it is democratic for audiences to take up such modes of reading. What role should presentist reading have in historical writing contract? This is also the question. And I would just add that the reading contract is a way of designing the relationship between the writer and the reader, and every writing, including historical writing, has a reader's contract embedded in it, which suggests how it can be read and at the same time assigns certain positions to the author and the reader. The content of the pact can be signaled by non-textual practices and components of historical works. So, well, the question would be, what does the democratic reading contract say about presentism? Okay, so to approach these questions, I describe the reading practices of historical writing that I have observed in historians' more or less formal, frequently autobiographical contributions about reading history books. Also, the literature on reading and fan practices, the instructions that typically in the introductions to their book, historians give to their audiences, reviews of historical literature, and articles covering historical debates. I also included readers' contribution posted on Goodreads.com, which is the largest social media platform dedicated to reading. And in my analysis, I focused on contributions to one particular book, this one, which is on the presentation, that is The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hamalainen from 2008. I hope I did not mispronounce the name. I chose it because of the diversity of the book audience. It was read by both professional and non-professional fans of historical writing, and this also includes historical theorists, because some time ago the book was a topic of one of the issues of history and theory. More than 1,500 ratings of the book have been published on the platform, of which 185 are accompanied by shorter or longer reviews. And this is sometimes just few words, but sometimes like 1,000 words. Readers summarized the book. They were enthusiastic about it. They were sometimes dissatisfied with its large size and detailed narrative and numerous repetitions. They share how the book connected to their personal experience, and finally they praise the book's argumentation and its new interpretation of the history of 18th and 19th centuries of the American Southwest. Okay, so now some assumptions that I have. So I'm interested here in the practices of consumers of historical writing, both professional and ordinary history fans. At start, I would like to challenge the distinction between the two groups of readers. Academic readers used to be regular readers, and they still are by using non-professional reading practices. Moreover, academic readers, like non-academic readers, invested a lot of affection and become attached to their reading and undertake different forms of presentist reading. This is because they devote a lot of time and energy to reading, which is a part of their professional duties. At the same time, ordinary readers are not, after all, deprived of reading training. Non-academics have many opportunities to come into contact with academic reading practices. All of them encountered professional reading practices at school. Some of them exercise them on social websites like Goodreads, while others read reviews in press or take part in book clubs. There are also other reasons to challenge this distinction. Re-evaluating the relationship between academic and ordinary readers can serve to bridge the social divide and abolish the hierarchical relationship between academic historians and their audiences. Since both modes of reading are not fundamentally different, the two groups will find it easier to communicate with each other, I think. This will, I believe, make the social engagement of history more democratic and maybe more productive. Historians will establish a more equal relationships with their audiences rather than try to rescue them. This is the first assumption. This is now the second one. And it says that reading a history book can be heterogeneous. It critically follows the historian's argumentation, while at the same time readers critically follow the historian's argumentation, while at the same time immerse themselves in the attractive examples accompanying the argument, and strongly identify the reader with questions and characters presented. Moreover, different ways of reading can work together. A critical distance mode of reading geared toward knowledge production does not have to compete with identificatory reading. immersive or recreational, but can interact with them. So the experience of being surprised by the reading, empathizing with the characters, and becoming attached to the topics addressed, and we can become attached to the topic like decolonization, class struggle, or climate crisis. This can fuel and enhance critical reading. The same is true of presentist reading practices. They can take different forms themselves and also occur sometimes in combination with other reading practices. Reading sometimes consists of several more or less critical, productive, self-consciously presentist forms, and is accompanied by recreational, cognitive, immersive reading practices. Okay, so now I'll go to a little bit into how presentism is discussed by historian of history. So what role does the presentist have in historians' imaginings about the reading of their works? We won't find a direct answer to this question in the historians' declarations, but it's possible to derive them from their comments about presentism itself. Some will reject to different degrees such practices of reading, others will support it. Okay, so historians in presentism. The first group, for example, includes one of the founders of Annales school, Lucien Febvre, who in 1942 book on the religiousness of François Rabelais condemned as a sin the attribution of present atheistic beliefs to the 16th century writer. Similarly, the presidents of American Historical Association, Lynn Hunt in 2002 and James H. Sweet in 2022, have criticized, to varying degrees and in more or less nuanced ways, presentism in historical studies and education for simplifying the images of the past, obscuring change over time, and differences between the present and the past periods, as well as fostering a sense of moral self-satisfaction among contemporaries at the expense of the past actors. I will return to this last accusation later, as it relates more strongly to the question of quality. Among the group of historians supporting a presentist reading was Jacques Le Goff, another representative of Annales school, preaching the importance of historical writing that serves to understand the present. Also prominent recently was the voice of David Armitage, suggesting, like Georg Gangl, that historical inquiry is in many ways always presentist, and Feuder arguing that historical knowledge should serve human flourishing. Both statements can be read as being more concerned with the reaction of lay audiences. The task of understanding the present or human flourishing is implicitly entrusted to a wider audience. So, what kind of reading practices do these statements suggest? The cited statements by opponents of presentism can be interpreted perhaps not as banning, although Lucien Febvre comes close to doing so, but strongly discouraging presentist reading for its simplistic, unethical, or undemocratic nature. Febvre, Hunt, and Sweet make the case that audiences should be more critical and democratic in their readings. Proponents of presentism, on the other hand, can be understood as seeing the advantages of the presentist reading in that it can appeal to a wider audiences. It is to them that they recommend reading historical works as a complex and indirect answers to the questions we ask ourselves in the present, especially about the condition of our world and its future. Okay, so now I would like to talk about 4 types of presentist reading. So readings of historical writing touch the public in many ways, rarely problematized by historians and historical theories. Readers often undertake presentist readings, and they take many forms. I have observed 4 types of such readings, which is worth adding are often interconnected. The first is a reading of historical writing geared towards readers' understanding of the present, while the second is a reading in which the audiences identify in various ways with elements of the past under discussion, most often human actors. The other 2 are actually separate forms of identification, and that is empathy and recognition. Critics of presentism accuse it of making us less critical, while those who recognize its usefulness in the production of knowledge show that it enhances our critical apparatus, let's say. In this part of the talk, I will also ask to what extent these forms of presentism reading can weaken and to what extent they heighten the critical capacities of the audience. So first, reading to understand presence. Reading historiography aimed at understanding the reader's world seems to coincide with the calls of Legoff and Armitage. Audiences choose books guided by questions about the present or relate their reading to current issues of public debate already in the process. They start the book with questions ready or formulate them by reading. Some will submit to reading and listen to what it tells them. Others will know the answer to their question before they even start reading. Some of the readers of the aforementioned The Comanche Empire indicated that the book helped them think about contemporary issues. So, for example, Peter Bradley, for him, these were debates over land acknowledgements. For Terence, the United States foreign policies. Another reader, Mabel, emphasized that she read the book because she participated in the protests against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2014-2016. The comment by already mentioned Terence received the highest number of likes on the site, which may be an indication of the extent to which other Google users share his approach to the Comanche Empire. So Terence is interested in indigenous nations' history and critical towards the myth of great American nation because of his past experience, such as joining the Boy Scouts as a child, where he first learned about indigenous nations' history, and his further readings. Terence writes that he learned a great deal reading Hämäläinen book. He mentions, it's a quote, intense pleasure I felt in discovering a world and an era that I never knew existed. He also adds that the book, another quote, enriches my understanding of my country's history, which I take to mean that his previous convictions about the history of United States were confirmed in his reading of Comanche Empire, but at the same time, the presentist perspective which he took with his reading was modified and reframed to a certain degree. For example, Terence writes that Hämäläinen book clearly challenges the circulating images of indigenous nations as noble, proud, and brave people engaged in an unequal struggle against European imperialism, or as a very traditional communities cut off from modernity. In fact, Hämäläinen portrays the Comanches as sometimes noble and brave, but sometimes calculating and cruel, and emphasizes the Comanches' contact with modern European communities, the flow of practices, knowledge and technologies, and Comanches' adaptation to operating in such contexts. Terence's reading seems to be driven by an attachment to Native American history and critical stance in contemporary discussions of American history. But at the same time, this partly presented stance, probably due to the convergence of authors and readers' positions, seemed to support and rather productively influence the reader's receptivity of the book's new complex suggestions for framing Comanche history. Also interesting in this context is the case of Jack H. Hexter. It's an American historian known for his research on early modern British history and comments on theoretical questions. Participating in the debate on presentism in the 1950s, Hexter argued against the long recurring argument in discussions of historical knowledge, proclaiming that we always study the past from a contemporary perspective, bringing into our research process often unwittingly issues and beliefs related to our present. So Hexter recounts his typical day filled with classes at university, reading historical records and literature, writing, and sometimes discussions, the vast majority of which are about the past. And he concludes that his today is not actually United States in the 1950s, but early modern England. His view of the past is not guided by 20th century political disputes, myths, and emotions, but conversely, it is early modern political disputes, myths, and emotions that guide him in his 20th century life. So if we take Hexter's statement seriously, It seems to illustrate the reading experience of a group of lay and professional history fans. It's difficult to say how large is this group, but I think this case shows that reading practices are anachronistic in different ways. Engagement with the past may be framed by readers' situatedness in the present, but the same engagement with the past conditions their understanding of the present. So my claim here is that these two processes may occur together and cooperate. Okay, another type of presentist reading. Identification-oriented reading was only partially thematized by participants in presentist debates. Meanwhile, audiences often use it, and the very identification practices of commingling, equating, comparing ourselves with our past actors are presentist in nature. So what does it mean to identify with a history book? Identification is the process of relating to someone or something that allows us to define ourselves. In the simplest terms, readers can compare themselves with a historical figure, recognizing similarities and differences. Historical figures can become models of behavior, negative examples, moral authorities, objects of fascination, friends, but also enemies. Identification can take complex forms. First of all, it does not have to mean just liking a particular historical figures. It can be combined with an ambivalent or even negative attitude towards them. An audience may recognize its own feature in a character, but relate to it with dislike. For example, readers recognize their society's patriarchal heritage, but condemn gender inequality practices. Second, it should be noted that identification looks for commonalities, but also pays a lot of attention to differences by engaging in discerning in which configuration the shared qualities occur in historical characters. Identification and presentism are not only, as Hans suggested, about making the past more similar to the present. The mechanism of identification generally also activates practices of comparing and noticing differences. Thirdly, identification can be either hampering or productive. One identification can close the reader off to further connections, or it can trigger other connections. It can merge and blur social categories, but it can also lead to entrenchment in the identity positions suggested. So identification with particular heroine, for example, Marie Skłodowska-Curie, may prompt the reader to focus only on her, but may also propel her to identify with other chemists, women scientists, Paul's French. One of the readers of Comanche Empire ended a longer commentary in which he spent considerable time praising the book for building a complex portrayal of Comanche with the words, quote, as much as I loved this book and its deep dive into Comanche history, and seeing them as vibrant, adaptable, and formidable people, I also kept thinking, yeah, but really, they were pretty terrible. The reader is fascinated by the book and its characters, the Comanches. He follows their fate closely and admires their ability to take advantage of difficult historical conditions to build a strong political entity, but at the same time, Comanche's methods of operation, especially their ruthlessness, aggressiveness, and cruelty, terrify him. So he identifies with this group, cheers them on in dealing with adversity, but at the same time, their practices repudiate him. Okay, now shortly, empathy. So two types of reader identification with historical writing worthy of particular attention are empathy and recognition. Empathy is the process of cognitive, emotional, and imaginative insight into and understanding of someone's feelings and thoughts, as well as sharing and responding attentively to that person's feelings and thoughts, while acknowledging that person's distinctiveness. This mode of reading is, on one hand, a component of historical inquiry, and on the other, remains an important reading practice to lay history fans. Empathy is regarded with suspicion as a practice that leads to too easy, uncritical, and sentimental putting oneself in the shoes of the other people and groups. For example, when privileged contemporary readers give in to the illusion that they know what it was like to be, say, a female worker in a tobacco factories of the pre-war Poland. In an empathic engagement with the past, however, there is an oscillation between the past and the present. Readers detach themselves from their own historical situation in order to understand the thoughts and feelings of the past ages. At the same time, the mechanism of empathy assumes that we can only understand the past others by referring to our own historical experience and finding the shared features of the lives of people in the past. Okay, and now recognition. So what does it mean then to recognize oneself in the book? As with the practice of identification, the reader compares his or herself with the characters, focusing more attention, however, on experiencing oneself, self-discovery, learning something about oneself. In addition to the emotional, this practice has a reflective component, as reading makes me come to know and feel about myself in an updated or different way. Category of recognition, of course, plays a large role in political and social studies in the context of struggles for social and political recognition. Different groups may demand recognition, that is, public acknowledgement of their dignity and equal participation in society by general public. The ongoing interest in the struggle for recognition, which has been underway for several decades, is due, among other things, to the observed efforts of various groups in society to demand recognition. Ethnic or racial minorities, women, LGBTQ groups, people with disabilities, or sex workers. The use of the word struggle suggests that the process of recognition of a given group rarely takes a harmonious form and meets with social understanding. Rather, it takes the form of a conflict, or it generates divisions, and often forces a painful resignation about one's identity. So how does the issue of struggle for recognition relate to reading of historical writing? So first, practices of self-recognition can inspire self-acknowledgement and also participation in struggles for social recognition. Reading historical writing can provide me with an experience of belonging, a sense that I'm not alone and that there were others who thought and felt as I did. I stop feeling invisible and realize that my qualities can be recognized as desirable and socially important. It can also lead the reader to identify, always risky, with the interests of another group and take sides in the struggle for recognition. On the side of the past unprivileged classes, for example, the Native Americans, the victims of the Second World War, and so on. Second thing is that the struggle for social recognition can use historical writing to achieve its goal. The visibility of a particular group in historical discourse, let's say women historians, straightens its position in society. Third, history books can serve as a laboratory for social recognition by providing knowledge on how the construction of a sense of community and self-knowledge, as well as the struggles of groups, have taken place in the past. With regard to historical writing, it seems that a key role is played by the mechanism of recognition, binding readers to national group or states. The relationship between historical writing, the state apparatus, and nationalism, as well as history, nationalism, and state origin, has been written about extensively. Historical writing has very often called and continues to call on its readers to become more or less actively involved in the national or state community, recognize in themselves that they are Finnish, Austrian, or Brazilian, whatever, and to claim their national or state history as their own. Reading history books can be about succumbing to this mechanism of power, but it can also become a practice of testing different forms of national and state belonging. Readers can use history as a device with which to consider the different ways in which an individual enters a community. And again, an example from Comanche Empire. So one of the already mentioned readers of Comanche Empire, Mabel, engaged in a fight for recognition on the side of another group, American indigenous nations. and she participated in the protest anti-Dakota Access Pipeline. In the case of this reading, the reader first joined the struggle for recognition, and only this pushed her to read Hamalainen's book. In her commentary, she writes that she wanted to learn about the history of indigenous nations that took part in the protest. Before Comanche Empire, she had also read other books on the subject, such as An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Ortiz. Most of her commentary is a list of things she found interesting in Hamalainen's book. Among them are facts that are contrary to the common knowledge of indigenous nations, like, for example, the Apache, which are represented by popular culture as being the most violent, strong, and brave of indigenous nations, were actually subjugated to the Comanche Empire. And the second thing she enlisted are Comanche actions that can be judged immoral from the point of view of the present. And this latter, including the construction of ruthless empire based on slavery, provoked the reader to ask questions that set Comanche practices in a historical context, which one suspects serves to kind of undermine their moral valuation. So Mabel asks about the differences between slavery in the Comanche Empire and in the American colonies. And then she asks also to what extent the imperial actions of Comanche were triggered by imperial actions of European settlers. And I think these are quite good questions. So identification with the group struggling for recognition seems in this reading to lead to the production of historical knowledge, if asking accurate questions can be considered as such. Okay, so what I've been doing for the last 15 minutes or so was to try to convince you that there are many forms of presentist reading and readers undertake them all the time. So even if historians try to avoid some forms of presentism in their writing, they are still likely to be read in presentist mode. Also, history education researchers argue that presentism is, this is a quote, our psychological condition at rest, a way of thinking that requires little effort and comes quite natural. They also add that in many schools around the world, students are taught to engage with the past in a presentist mode, including reading historic books, evidenced by school curriculum. They are designed to teach students to relate past figures, events, processes, or ideas to the present, for example, by incorporating them into narratives of national history. So with presentist reading being so popular and taking so many different forms, how do we get audiences to choose the more egalitarian ones? So let me start with Lynn Hunt's aforementioned argument against presentism. She criticized presentism for creating a sense of moral self-congratulation, being more self-congratulation among contemporaries at the expense of the past actors. In presentist studies and readings on gender, racial, and class inequalities, the failure to adapt contemporary concepts to the examined past, the unification of its depiction, and the exposure of contemporary ethical judgments will lead to a sense of self-satisfaction among authors and audiences, and a conviction of a moral superiority of the present over the past. So Lynn Hunt warns that, pointing out that the ancient Greeks practiced slavery and that David Hume was a racist, often serves to improve how we feel about ourselves. In addition to building an unequal relationship with the past, this complacency may also result in a failure to see the continuation of these inequalities in our time, that is, racism and slavery. So, how do we avoid non-egalitarian modes of presentist reading? A general answer would suggest that if we ask the past questions about the difficulties, challenges, and hopes we have for our present, then we can listen to the inquired past and be ready to change our preconceptions and knowledge about it and about our world under the influence of the reading. We should not look to the past for what we already know anyway, but assume that we ourselves and our understanding of the past and the present can be changed in the process of reading. It also means relinquishing some control over reading. Instead of making things happen, just letting things happen. So what are the implications of this for historians? How to make historical writing be read in this way? And then how to build the contracts that would include this kind of readings, a reading contract that we could call egalitarian. So I think it seems to be misguided to instruct and impose certain reading behaviors on readers directly or implicitly, manipulate them so they read in the way defined by the authors. Such action builds an unequal relationship between with the audiences, which assumes that it is the authors who have reading competence and know what is best for readers, while the latter do not have such competence and are ignorant. It is also inconsistent with the very content of these instructions. For authors will then be urging readers to be democratic towards the past and the reading process, while at the same time building an unequal relationship with them. Okay, so I offer here some three suggestions for the use in historical writing. How can these ideas that I mentioned before be translated into specific practices? And more precisely, with what sort of means would the author be expected to enter into the described egalitarian contract? The first step for authors to build such an agreement is to relinquish control over the reading process, including implicitly influencing the audience to read it in a certain way and preventing them from undertaking other reading practices. Authors can construct their books and articles so that they are open to different modes of reading. If authors design readings of works in which they do not manipulate the audience, but suggest to them that they can respond to the work in different ways, they will make their relationship with the audience closer to equal, and this may create in readers a disposition to undertake such an equal reading. The next step is to undertake reading practices consistent with the idea of receptivity in our own work. We can perform receptive readings of various forms of historical records, as well as the works of other scholars, or simply comment on the actions of past humans and non-human actors. Most often, this will involve the careful, critical reading expected of historians, which in this case, however, should initially take a cooperative rather than suspicious attitude. The willingness to undergo change, which is a component of receptivity, finds its analog in historical practices in the willingness to modify claims and arguments under the influence of other scholars or when confronted with research material. Often historians do not reveal such modifications in their research processes, limiting themselves to presenting the final outcomes of their investigations. From the perspective of building an equal contract with audiences, it would be more effective not to hide these components of the study from readers and demonstrate that researchers can be wrong and that new readings can cause a change in the understanding of the object under study, history as discourse, and the worlds in themselves. So by taking the position of a reader with a receptive attitude in our own readings, we can suggest the audience to adopt a similar attitude toward our own work. Finally, the last component of establishing equal agreement with audiences is historians exposing of research contracts made in the course of their investigations. In addition to other academic researchers, this includes vernacular researchers, spokespeople of opinion, informants, archivists, librarians, museum professionals, and other holders of historical records. By entering and executing receptive agreements with them, we prompt the opportunity for audiences to build a similar relationship with us. Okay, so just in conclusion, I wanted to kind of repeat what I just said, but in just a few points. So in this talk, I try to tackle the question, what role should presentist reading have in the democratic historical writing contract? I provided some examples of presentist reading by historians and their audiences. And this also included reading of historical writing geared towards readers' understanding of the present and different practices of identification. And then I offered the three elements of democratic historical contract. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, before we will start now, first in the room a question, and then I will unmute online. So if anybody has a question here first, or comment, or criticism, then please. Yeah,
Please connect.
Yeah,
All the audience.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's I hope screen sharing is stopped automatically. Okay.
Screen share.
Okay. Yeah, that's something. Please start. I will. Anybody has something?
Well, I can begin
Yes.
if anyone
Please, yes.
doesn't volunteer. I guess I start with this big clarificatory question about the presentism and presentist reading itself. What is it actually? What is presentist reading? The opposition would be anti-presentist, but often those who many people claim argue for presentist reading, they say that it's the only. You can't read it all. Beliefs, our presumptions. So the only look from our time that we are doing it anyway, or historian or someone is doing it. So there's a presentism in any case. So is it really a choice, or is it a necessity to do presentist reading? And if it's a necessity, we have to do it necessarily. Then my question is, what are you actually doing here? Is it that you are putting together just some principles of reading? And then the follow-up question sort of, presentist reading, if it's a necessity, it can be a bad thing because willy-nilly we have to do it. So is it like there's good presentist reading and bad presentist reading? Or what is the setup in this way? Because of course one could argue for the other that presentism is always wrong because it leads to anachronism, and therefore we have to try to understand these three aspects.
And so I think that presentist reading and presentist writing is a kind of a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all do it, and we don't really have a choice. But there are different forms of presentism, and one are like better and other are worse. I prefer to say that some are more egalitarian and some are not. Some are maybe more productive, some are not. And yeah, and what I was trying to do here is to present all those forms of presentist reading, some big part, let's say, of them, and perhaps also show that they are not that bad. I mean, those presentist readings sometimes seem unproductive and unegalitarian and wrong. But then if we kind of analyze them, it seems that connected with other ways of reading, and this is always the case that there are other ways of reading taking place at the same time, they can produce something good. Some historical knowledge also. Okay, so and what I was aiming at was to suggest, to offer some rules for writing in a way that will maybe influence readers to take those better, good types of presentist reading with our work and with work by our colleagues.
And that's very good typology you made. So I could have a short follow-up.
Maybe we have a question online already, but it's a short follow-up to it.
Just still focusing on the concept of presentism. Then would it not be possible just to state in the beginning that presentist reading is the only reading we have? Because the question is, if those are presentist reading, why are they presentist reading? What is the sort of presentist element that goes into all those readings? There are some principles of reading, I can see that. But what is identification and so on? What is presentism in those principles in themselves? And finally, that's my question. Finally, I just said that, of course, if you are a pragmatist, or if you are like I kind of agree that it always is. Whatever you do to produce knowledge, you state something that it's an interest. There's some interest. Of course, in right history, I'm studying the past. There's always the interest. So there's my interest and our interest, or something that comes into the picture.
So you are suggesting that I should not go into detail with these different ways of practicing.
I'm saying that
does
presentism as a concept doesn't do any work if it's sort of necessary. It's the base level. So the basic argument could be that the only principled way to read is presentism. And if you don't agree with that, you're wrong, basically. It's philosophically wrong because it's not possible to read things.
Yeah, I didn't try that from this angle.
Okay. So this may be for further things, because I was just thinking that what is the really contribution of presentism? Okay.
Yeah, we had a second screen here, unfortunately shut itself off. But I hope everybody online can still hear and see as well. So, but next is Bowen from online. If you have a question, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. I actually find it very useful in terms of like you putting up some kind of ways that the layman audience would approach the historiographical work. But I guess my question is, you propose a way of doing democratic reading. It seems that you've put up this kind of thing against the kind of in-democratic way of reading. I just wonder, what does it mean? Because in one of your slides, you said that historians sometimes, here's a quote, implicitly influence the audience to undertake it in a certain way or preventing them from undertaking other practices. Is that what do you have in mind as an undemocratic way of reading? Or if it is the case, I doubt that historians actually have the ability to control over the audience, how they are going to read your historiographic texts, because sometimes it is the audience who take over what is the standard way of reading a historiographical case. Because I am now doing some research about naturalism Davis, and I realized that, although if you really paid attention to the argumentation that naturalism Davis had in The Return of Martingale, you would know that she actually supports a multiple way, different possibilities of reading this kind of story. But the audience seems to take naturalism Davis' version of the story as a kind of canon, the only way to understand the story. So it is the audience who are performing a kind of undemocratic way of reading, not the author intended to do so. So that's just my question. What do you have in mind as a kind of a non-democratic way of reading or providing historical texts?
Okay, so what I had in mind are mostly some means of designing historical writing that would influence reader without him knowing that he's influenced by historian. The historian is like direct about what he's doing. He writes that I would like you to understand this and this in this way. This is, I think, okay. But if we try to make him do things without saying to him that we are doing it to him, the reader, then it's something. Then I would consider this non-egalitarian. And I think that there were many discussions in theory of history in last few decades about how to write history, and well, starting with Hayden White, for example. And we sometimes debate on how to write history about climate crisis, how to write history about some difficult heritage and so on, to influence people to, I don't know, be better citizens or be engaged in fighting the climate crisis. And these discussions, they also involve this kind of manipulation on the side of historians. So you can make, for example, readers of the books about climate change. Like we can try to scare them, for example, to mobilize them to act against the climate crisis. Yeah, and this will be kind of a way. This will be kind of writing that I would consider non-egalitarian. Okay, and you also mentioned anachronism in Davies. Yeah, I remember hearing your talk in Lisbon about Davies and about also it was about reception, if I corrected, if I remember this correctly. Yeah, and Davies does what you said, that she kind of invites readers to read her book in different ways, and then the readers sometimes do it in non-egalitarian ways. Well, I mean, this is what we can do. We can ask readers to be egalitarian, and we can try to practice egalitarian practices, and with this kind of make them also practice his egalitarian practices. And this is, I think, the means that I have right now at hand. So if we read in egalitarian way, maybe it will make readers also to read our works in egalitarian way. Okay, thanks.
You.
There was just some more? Yeah. Okay, we have also, now we're back to the room. We have several more questions on them, which is great.
Try the connection that we could see there.
Yeah, no, I just tried and then everything went off. So even
sometimes the very little.
The microphone. So I would suggest not to do it for the moment. I'm sorry, we cannot see. Only I can see the people on them because it's on my screen now only. I'm sorry for that. We can come here if you want to see them. Right. So we're back to the room. From the moderator, I would have a question which relates to that, the democratic issue. But if somebody else in the audience wants to go first, I'll lead to them. Otherwise, it fits itself, I think. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm interested too. Could we say actually that you were giving us the presentist political reading of the whole of historiography instead of just of one work? Because you were interested in egalitarianism and egalitarian readings, egalitarian concerns in politics. Therefore, you think historiography should also serve those ends and serve the democratic egalitarianism that you think is politically what we should go for, in that sense, right? So therefore, we should avoid hierarchical relationships between reader and writer. But I would suggest you to draw the line exactly where the egalitarianism ends and where the hierarchical relationship must begin, because in many respects, a historian is an expert and the reader, which is not another historian, is not an expert, cannot become equal, like epistemically. Also, in probably in many other respects as well, you know. So I mean, if you try to abolish any kind of hierarchical relation between reader and writer, you end up with some kind of empty anarchism and everything. I would not want that. And then historiography would lose its distinctiveness of producing knowledge of the past. historiography can do. No matter what readers want, that's the expertise that historians have. Readers can have all different kinds of issues with why they read historiography, so they can for pleasure or for moral edification, or whatever the word is. And related to that, on the democratic reading contract, I have the question to be a bit more precise on what it exactly means. Because if you, not the contract, but how you were fleshing it out with these 3 points, when you were saying relinquishing control over reading and avoid manipulation. I mean, of course, control cannot be the author doesn't stand on the back or the shoulder of the reader and controls how they read. You know, they are separate processes divided by time, and so that sense there's no control on that level. So what does it actually mean, control here, in the sense? And the second point was then receptivity, sort of that what was that? That people show their research material and how they change their mind instead of just giving their new thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't it be equally egalitarian in one sense or democratic to just give the new argument that you think is right, and then you give the reader why you think the new argument is right? And that's the democratic way, because in that sense, you just be as precise and clear in your argument as you can without showing all the twists and turns that you made, because it can be very confusing. When I think about my own thinking, if I would push that on anybody else, I wouldn't wish anybody to see that, how I arrived at certain things, you know. But the end product is might be still worth considering, you know. That's when we talked about over lunch once. That's when it's what Popper said, what democratic is about, certain writing, clear, crisp, give the argument, and then let the reader make whatever they wish out of it, in terms of. And then the third was the research content. I have no problem with that you sort of acknowledge people who, like in archives and so forth. But I guess I'm sure it's a set of questions, but it's
Okay. Thank you. I'll try to do my best. Okay, so how to be egalitarian and to what degree you should be egalitarian? Well, I don't know, obviously, but I think we can like try different things and see what will happen. I guess that what we would like to achieve is that our readers will hear what we are saying and try to cooperate with us. And to build this kind of cooperation, I think equality is important to that.
okay. It was very guarded.
Yeah. You also asked about the control over how we control readers.
It was manipulate. That's a very strong word, you know. Because historians try to manipulate their reader. That's quite a claim. Think about it.
Okay, so I guess we kind of try to control the reader when, as I mentioned before, when we try to see something that he's unaware of. But the other means, I guess that controlling reader would also mean to kind of build our authority on, also by hiding that how we came into some insights into some outcomes. Because then the reader won't be able to see how exactly we came there, and he won't be able to kind of mirror our way, at least in a certain degree. So what we offer him is only the knowledge, but not the ways to get this knowledge. And I guess that for reader, it will be harder then also to kind of get into discussion with us, because he only gets the results, doesn't get how we get there. I mean, of course, I guess that in your writings you can also show some steps that you made to achieve some goals. But I guess if we show more steps and also those places where we kind of get to some dead end, have to come back, and when we failed in some way, that may be better for our communication with the reader, and he would gain more by having this too.
Okay.
So, on the other hand, I do understand that this can be really confusing to read a paper in which there will be this.
Maybe I misunderstood also. I thought you meant showing the way was like showing how we personally feel like historically arrived at what we're thinking. But the way you phrase it now, it sounds like showing the steps in an argument, which of course you need to do, otherwise it's an effective argument. But that's historians already doing, so hopefully they do it. But there are many more questions, maybe I should. Okay, next was Václav, I think, from online. Please.
Hello, hi. It's
Hello.
good to see all of you again here. Thank you for the lectures, very good. I have two questions. First is that when people read history books, lay readers, what are they actually reading? Are they reading the historical narrative that is imposed by the author, historian, or something related to my own research? Like, are they reading the argumentative narrative, the argumentation structure of the author, or they just read nothing, they just read on their own, anything that could resonate with themselves, like even like a single page or illustration, like it's totally on their own. And my second question is that presentism usually takes a negative connotation among historians. Like we are told at first day in class that you should not be a presentist as a historian. But it's inevitable. I'm asking, like, within the history profession, what would you think presentist reading or presentism in general would actually affect historians' choice on their topic, research topic, given especially in North America, like the unproportionately increased attention on gender and race, those topics. People are more interested in those topics because they think they will attract a larger audience. Or like if I'm a historian of genocide, I would rather working on the Holocaust, the Shoah, rather than the Armenian genocide or other parts, or the Nanking. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so it's really hard to say how deep the readers go into the narrative or the argumentative narrative. I guess I tried to find some examples of the descriptions of the reading practices, both by historians, but also by lay readers, those coming from the Kulitzkom. And I guess I wouldn't be able to answer your question in conclusive ways based on what I found. I mean, there are the material that I have, the reports that I gathered, that doesn't allow me to do that. But then, of course, the professional historians, I assume they do different things with the papers and book they read. Because, of course, what we frequently do as academics, we just go into some papers and books to find this one particular information that we need to do our research, and then just stop reading and go to another thing that we need. But on the different occasions, we go into the book fully. We read narrative, the arguments, and there are other things. And we also, I think, practice some immersive reading, recreational reading too, as professional historians. Sorry, this is all I can say about the first question. When it comes to the second question about presentism and how or whether we can use it in our professional writing, that was not like a primary focus of my presentation, and I don't think I will be able to answer your question now. Sorry. Thanks a lot. I will think about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we should get back to the room. There's somebody who wants to.
How many are they online?
Yeah, 2 or 3 more
Questions.
Type in the chat. Yes, I mean.
Let's just take from there if no one raised.
You would like to go again, or?
No, but if there are people who are waiting.
Okay, yeah, it's good to go. We'll prioritize people who haven't spoken yet. Okay, the next, I think this is a combined question. It's a cooperation of Nick and Knife online. Nick Nielsen, Knife, albeit. So Nick asks, written in the chat, if a presentist reading is the only reading we have, the only material said, does that mean a historicist reading is not possible? And then he specifies by historicist, he means in the Rankian sense, not in the proper sense. And a similar question from Knife, can we view a historicist relativist reading as the opposite of a presentist one? I guess then, can we view, I guess the question is, does it even make sense then to talk about that? So I guess the question generally is, what about then what has been, I mean, historicism has a lot of meanings even in the Rankian sense, but what can we have a historicist reading? Can we have a simple, wie es eigentlich gewesen reading, if everything is present? It's maybe or something of that sort, maybe perhaps, I'm not sure exactly what.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I know this distinction between presentist and historicist reading, so I won't know what you mean. I guess we can try to do that, but then I don't think we have to. This is kind of my argument today, that we can remain presentist. And I don't think that most of the forms of presentism can affect our research, our communication with galleries. And also, can presentist reading, can this historicist reading a presentist reading?
Yeah, is it possible to have a historicist reading in all readings of presentist? I guess is the question.
Okay.
I mean, if you say we cannot avoid presentism, then kind of historicist readings must be presentist to its level.
Yeah. This practice of empathy is kind of like mixing both, because we try to feel and think in the same way as someone from the past. So we are kind of doing this historicist practice, move there and think, like to try to think and feel as the person from the past, like to take, like to have his values, his perspective, his way of looking at the world and himself or herself. So this is what we do as when we engage in empathy, but at the same time, we are kind of presentist because we may do it only when we compare, when we are basing on our knowledge about ourselves, our world, and our values. So this is a kind of a blurring of those two distinctions. Right? With the distinction. Yeah.
Yes, that's why I looked at before, but Knife also had the question relating to that. You answered that if a historicist relativist reading can be the opposite of a presentist one, and if so, could it also have negative social and political implications? Oh no, wait. Could presentism also have negative sort of lack of historicism? That's sorry, that's the question. So we should read it again because only I see it here, because our screen doesn't work. So the question is also a similar question. Can we view a historicist relativist reading as the opposite of a presentist one? You might have answered that. If so, what could be the possible negative social or political implications of presentism, since historicism had negative consequences, prices of historicism, etc.? I guess you said that presentism can lead to egalitarian politics, but presumably it can lead to negative politics as well in the forms of presentism. But that's the question, what could they be?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there are different forms of presentism, and some are leading us to, I guess, bad politics and unethical behaviors. And there are also those good ones that I think are those egalitarian ones. that may help us in this, let's say, later with human flourishing.
Just a little follow-up on this. I think there's two questions that, and one is, can we do anti-presentist historist reading? And I think that's a sort of epistemological question. Can we do it? If we cannot, we must be always presentist, no matter what someone claims about historist reading and so on. But if we can do it, then the question is, should we do it? Or rather, should we not do it? Maybe it's not virtuous to do historist reading, it's virtuous to do presentist reading. Or in some form, or in some mode, you can do either historist or presentist reading. But I think those are the fundamental things, claims.
As Kant said, what implies can. You have to. It has to be possible first for you.
Yeah. I think that's well said. You don't need to answer, but if you have, but I think those are the sort of those rounding the stages of the whole discussion.
I mean, I also think, I'm sorry, but we can define presentism in such trivial ways that everything is presentist. I mean, there's this. Naomi Oreskes has defined presentism as historians are motivated to look at the research subject object through their own present. That's of course trivially true. If that is what we mean by presentism, then every historian is presentist, you know. So it's a bit what Johnny Matteo says in the first question. Some of the presentism might be so trivial or uninteresting in a political respect that it doesn't really matter to call it presentist or not. The distinction is really not operational, perhaps. Yeah, sorry, but is there a room? Somebody else was there? People didn't speak yet.
Yeah, I have one question. I'm trying to think of the kind of presentism and democratic practices together, but I think I'm confused or hung up by the fact that there's actually two different places where each can occur. One of which is the author or the historian's research practices and views of their own work. They can bring, I would presume, a presentist view of the historical data. They can select certain data over others. And so that, in theory, could also have a democratic or undemocratic practice, depending on kind of how they're using it. But then there's a secondary place where that happens, where they then present that information to the reader in their own writing. And so they can choose to present the writing with as little comment as possible. So these are the facts as I found them. This is what this person said. Here's the quote. This is the date that it happened. And as little commentary as possible, or they can create an argument that is extremely personal of their own. It could be extremely presentist, for example, of saying, look at how morally corrupt this person was by our own values because he didn't this and this. But I'm curious about how your kind of views of pro-democratic history and historiography relates to these two different facets. Is there a democratic way of doing the research that is independent of the way that it is presented in one's own writing? Can one do undemocratic research and very presentist, and those two things are independent. Can one do presentist research and present it in an unpresentist way? Or can one do unpresentist research but then present it in a fully presentist way? Can one do undemocratic research but present it in a democratic way? Can one do democratic research but then present it in a very undemocratic way? How do those two things relate to one?
I guess they are pretty connected. What I was suggesting is that in our writing, to be democratic is to show how we made our research also, how we came up with our insights, how we work with, let's say, other writings and historical records in general. And by showing that we were egalitarian, democratic in our research practices, we can also kind of convince readers to be democratic, egalitarian toward our writing, the reading. I also mentioned this research contract that I think maybe explicitly described in historical writing. So I guess it also should be egalitarian, this research contract, and also kind of convince readers to establish with us a reading contract which will be egalitarian. This reading contract can, I guess, mirror the research contract that we described in our writings. So in this way, this phase of research and the phase of writing and reading linked.
To look puzzled, any short follow-up?
Well, it just occurs to me that those two things are going to be inherently very different in that the historical works or data that one is looking at was not crafted, presumably, to be egalitarian. At least it's very unlikely that those facts were somehow written down or recorded in some way with the explicit purpose of being democratic. So if we are now going to try to be egalitarian moving forward, our work is inherently different than kind of what was in the past. And so we are bringing an agenda to something that was not there. And that is in fact, and I guess this is maybe one of the things I'm commenting, is that seems to, you are imposing an agenda on the historian in that process. You are saying you should be presenting your work with a specific goal that may be contrary to their own arguments and maybe, is maybe not in whatever it is that they're presenting. So it may actually call for presenting the historiography in a specific way that is potentially contrary to their own work and is potentially contrary to the historiography itself or kind of the underlying narrative. Potentially, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that historical records were produced in non-egalitarian ways. There was maybe some violence involved in it and so on. So I have to kind of take it under consideration when I'm talking about a research that is egalitarian. What about it? This is what it meant?
Yeah, I mean, in that if our intention is to be egalitarian, I don't think there's any reason we should assume that the things that we're writing, that was also their intention. Mm-hmm. And so there is a kind of inherently presentist action there. And again, I'm just trying to think about these two aspects of like how do we do the research in an egalitarian way? What does that mean to do kind of research in an egalitarian way? And then what does it mean to present it in an egalitarian way? Especially because certain modes of writing, I guess one of my suspicions is that an egalitarian form of presenting that work is also potentially really boring. And so, like, if you're trying to promote an emotional connection, for example, if that's kind of one of the things you're hoping to do, that involves a certain use of language that is evocative. Using adjectives that are compelling, even morally unbalanced. This was a corrupt person. This was a dark act. This was a dark period in history. You use the word dark. These things are inherently unegalitarian. They are an attempt to cause the reader to view that thing in a certain moral light. But if you write without any of that, it's really flat and kind of boring. And so should we be trying to create boring writing with like weak arguments because that way it is as open to interpretation as possible?
Yeah, this is a good question. We also talk about it with Georg for a couple of days already, and others on Tuesday. I tend to think first that this could be a kind of a solution for egalitarian writing to, as you said, be written in this way that we offer some description of historical records, but with no or just a little comment from ourselves. And in this way, we can like leave the interpretation of those historical records to the readers, and that would be democratic. So now I don't think this is like the best way to do it. It's more like I think that we should avoid the things I talked about earlier. So to kind of make a reader to act in a certain way without knowing him, that we try to make him do it. This, I think, is inegalitarian. To like write a paper that is well structured, I think that it does not break or violate the rule of egalitarian writing. Okay. And you also asked about historical or just different histories that are violent, that are dark, whether we can present violent history in egalitarian way. I guess we can, and I'm not sure if I'm following here. Violence that took place.
Sorry. The video came up offline. Yes, usually we will go online now, but there's some technical difficulty here now. They don't see us anymore either, unfortunately. But go on, Amanda. Please go. I'll try to set it up again.
Okay. Since we compared the presentism between the historical writing and the historical reading, I think maybe we should consider the complexity of the readership. As a professional history work, for example, even in the same time, readers can be peers and non-professionals. In this sense, the history and its audience are asymmetrical. And the complexity of historical writer is much less than the readers, because you can focus a small group. That's much easier than to analyze the complex of readers. The readers are quite complex. Maybe the readers are come from, as in the future, even in the same time we now are living. They are quite different. So my question is, to what extent can the author interfere with the reader's reading? In what way? And the next question is, I'm not sure. It's not clear. Your question are focusing on the readers, or on how the history should write her works to satisfy or influence their readers. That's the second question. If not clear, you can ask me. I hope I expressed my thinking.
So there are different groups of readers, and how can we try to influence them?
Right, because this is a much more difficult question to focus on there, to research on the present term from the reader's perspective. I think so. Although you talked in the lecture, readers can get what they want from now. Maybe there are questions like, I'm not alone when reading this book. He has a similar idea like me. But that's one of the It's one of the maybe one of the question, and I think the readers are very complex. They have different knowledge background, and they have different questions. But the historians is more easier. You can train, can set some courses to train the historians how to write a good history, how to write events of the past. But it is hard to focus a small group of readers. The readers are very complex. So that's my conclusion after this lecture.
Okay. So I kind of tried to show in this talk that, well, readers are different, or is that they
complex the history, I think.
And so the question is, how can we influence like all of those different readers?
Yes. I think to what extent can author, can historian to interfere with their audience, the readers?
Well, I think that there are different means to do that. I guess that when reader approaches a historical book, he's kind of already prepared to read it in certain ways. I mean, he recognizes that this is a history book, there is a title, and he kind of programs the reading.
Okay, it expressed in another way. I mean, you set your position in readers or in historians to give this lecture. You as a reader or as an audience of history or as the historian self. You set yourself as readers or as the authors of history.
I kind of focus my attention on readers of historical writing, but then I wanted to provide some solutions for the history writers. I'm still not sure what you were asking about, sorry.
This because you can see the introduction, you said much attention has been paid so far to presentism in historical writing and less presentism in the consume of history writing.
Yeah.
I mean, focus on the consume history writing that you set your position in the readers. But the readers are complex. You only can represent yourself, but you yourself maybe as a professional scholar in this field.
So maybe if you take all potential readers into account, it's really a massive crowd.
Yeah.
And they can be totally different. And you seem to be proposing that you can have some influence, even control. And how would you, if they are very different from each other, they might react totally differently.
Yes,
or something like that. In the future,
Right.
completely different kind of being, different kind of beliefs and geographically.
This is correct.
Yes,
That was what I understood. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, so we had, I guess, assumed the position that we are unable to influence readers in any way, that they can do everything they want with their papers, with our books, let's say. But I guess that's kind of like logical or nothing. It's a way to approach this problem. And still we have some arguments for that suggest that authors can communicate with readers and can influence the way that they read, and it kind of works for 3,000 years already. We have kind of communication. I mean, writers had communication with their audiences all the time, and the books are read, which means that this works. And Well, usually, I guess it's in the way that well, the writer kind of designs the audience, the modeled audience, the ideal audience of his writing. Thinks that okay, I will write for this particular group, and they think in that way, and this they like, and they dislike. And because of that, I can design my writing in this particular way, and maybe I will achieve these results thanks to that. And I guess that most of the writing works this way, and the readers also recognize the fact that the writing was written in this particular was written from this perspective, that the writer projected some kind of reader, and they decide whether they want to fit in that or not, or they just don't do it and read like that, read it without thinking much about the writer. But I guess that, yeah, that the communication is there.
We have
Consumption.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
We have one more question online, and maybe then afterwards, but
Yeah.
we are going to a close now. Yes. So the question online comes back to the question of manipulate. You said, again by Nick Nielsen. The question is, manipulate is a strong word. Another strong word would be pander, as in an author who panders to his readers. Isn't the historian who is trying to avoid a hierarchical stance in relation to readers at risk of pandering? So if a very hierarchical reader is supposed to manipulate, a very unhierarchical reader might pander to, an unhierarchical writer might pander to the needs or ideologies of the readers, I guess is the question. You follow the readers along whatever they want to hear, and this is also what historians should want to, right?
Yeah. Of course, there's this kind of risk, but I guess if we are trying to be egalitarian, we kind of think about it too. I mean, that we don't want to pander our readers, and we don't want to be condescending towards them. So we are not trying to just fit to their expectations. This would be pandering them and not being egalitarian. And I guess this
It wouldn't be egalitarian.
Wouldn't be egalitarian. It's not about making things easier for the reader. I mean, this is not egalitarian way.
That's not entirely clear to me. Egalitarian in respect to what they say. But is there any last round in here?
I have another thought.
Yes, I also have one, but I hear you.
It's just very briefly, and no need to answer either. So one idea is that how close is this to, sociologists used to talk about self-reflexivity. How close is your project is to self-reflexivity, the reflexive program, as it used to be called, that you write as a researcher into the research, as if a participant, not just an anonymous thing, writes a report. Because you talk about things that not being manipulative, and at some point you say that you could write about thoughts that this process gave to you and tell them to the readers. So is it the self-reflexivity and this kind of sincerity about what you're doing? So that's one. And another point is that getting back to the kind of dystopian idea of egalitarian thing. And in the worst case, I guess it would be some kind of the Twitter or exo historiography, where everyone is on equal footing to say absolutely everything. I guess that's a dystopian. I understand you don't mean to that either. There are no borders, no lines, no criteria. And the final thing I mentioned in this, my ex-teacher, University of Turku, Jorma Kaleva, he used to have this idea of kind of similar than you, be self-reflective, and he kind of has this kind of democratic idea of as well doing collaborative work with workers to write their own histories and this kind of stuff. So his point of view about historian is not an expert who looks from above, but it's like a consultant. So you need still historians' expertise, but you do it together. An historian has some skill set, a toolbox, so he can be consulting how to do good history.
Can I put my comment on that? What that with sociology? I said to you before too, I think a lot of what you're saying would need as an underpinning a certain quantitative or not sociology of historiography and its readership. On one, why do people read historiography? That's what Amanda said, readers come with all different kind of interests, all different kind of needs to historiography. And the other would be, do the forms and measures that you think lead to egalitarianism in the writers, we write in the readers, sorry, we write differently, and then as egalitarians, do they actually accomplish that in the readers? That's also what we need to see what they make out of it. You know? I think Amanda's very, very right. Readers are very willful, they are very sort of, they come with all different kinds of mindsets and frameworks and whatsoever. So everybody tries to be even more equal. An egalitarian might see that it's a kind of ironic task, perhaps, given what readers have in mind, you know. Okay, but maybe you. I think you can have the last word now if you want.
Okay. So thanks for all the questions. I will think about them. I will later have to ask Mati again about the first thing he said about self-reflexivity and sincerity. And when I thought about egalitarian history, I also thought about all those examples of people who tried to build democratic history, like, for example, in oral history, the Romanian have some that too. This was kind of what I had in mind, but I tried to put it on a kind of a different level of theoretical reflection and maybe from a different angle. Okay, and sociology of the leadership, yeah, I mean, it could be done, yeah. There's this very interesting book by Claudio Benzacris. He's a sociologist of music, but also culture, let's say, because the book is about opera fans in Argentina. And what he says there at the beginning is that there are many research concerning fan groups, but they're only but they only about the fan groups of popular culture, like history games, Star Wars, Metallica, music groups. But there isn't many research about fans of things like opera, highbrow culture, and in this case, historical reading. Although I guess that we can consider research on reenactment as a kind of description.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much. We will reconvene on the 26th in 3 weeks. Today we will talk about colligation and colligatory concepts in integrated philosophy of science. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.